This is a presentation that I've put together for our group, and I hope everybody enjoys it. It is information about how to create a book of your family history that is age appropriate for your descendants, whether they're little kids, middle schoolers, teenagers, whatever. My disclaimer is, I am not a certified genealogist. I have done family history books for my family. I've done the research, I've written them, but they've been primarily for adults only. That doesn't mean that my teenage nieces and nephews haven't looked at them, but I've created them for the adults. I have done family photo books that I've had printed that are created to be intergenerational. And in fact, my nieces and nephews, of which I have 23, have even used them to introduce their fiancés into our family by having them look through these books and get a sense of who we are historically. I'm also a member of several genealogy societies and historical societies. So the reason I do this is because I really want to encourage more people to research their family history, to write their family history down before it's too late. And there's lots of stories about that. I wish I would have asked my mother. I always heard this story from my dad, and now I can't remember it. So it's really important to collect these stories while they're fresh in your memory. So here's an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. So the first topic will be deciding on which ancestor of interest you want to share with a descendant. So who is it that you want to share? Do you want to share information about yourself, your parents, your grandparents, whatever? The second step then obviously is to collect all your facts, all the family lore, all the stories that are out there, whether they're true or not, and then photos, of course, that's always helpful. The next step is to revise your text based on the age of the descendant that you're going to share this with. So obviously you'll not necessarily dumb it down, but you'll young it down to the younger children, and then you'll make it more detailed or more specific for an older child. The next step then will be to actually write your story, put the information in about your descendant, and then start adding local history or significant international history. We'll talk about using a pedigree chart or a family group chart to show the relationship so that especially a younger person, they understand this is my father's mother, or this is my father's father, not my great-grandfather maternally or something. That gets too confusing for younger kids. And then the last option is, the last topic will be options for creating the book, what it'll look like and how it might look based on the age of the descendant that you're going to be giving it to. So here we go. So deciding on an ancestor of interest to the descendant. So it may not necessarily be someone that you're interested in sharing the story with, but how can you make it interesting to the person you're going to give this information to? Many people have more than one grandchild, so they end up writing it generically so that they can share it with all their grandchildren, or you can just then fine tune it so that you can change it for each grandchild as an example. So as we talked about before, deciding which ancestor, hopefully you've already done some research or you've already written something. If not, then you'll be starting from scratch, and there's not a problem with that. So basically decide who you're going to be working on, and who are you going to focus your research on, and hopefully it's someone who had an interesting life or an unusual life story. So in my case, it would be if I was writing to a young 3 to 8-year-old, I would write about the farmers in my life who have fed the world. They fed their families and the world. So they may not be that interesting, but there's a story to go along with it. Where they came from, which countries they immigrated from, and how they were farmers there and farmers here. So it doesn't have to be that they had to be a astronaut or an author or some special person, but they're all special and they've all got a story, and that's what we're trying to capture. Obviously, it's easier to do this if you actually personally knew the individual so that you have more interesting stories to tell rather than just born, died, married, just the basic information. That gets pretty boring for adults, let alone for children. And the last point here is basically be as intentional as possible about the legacy that you're leaving, the information that you're leaving about your ancestors and or yourself to your descendants, so that it's a very intentional thing that you're doing. And also to note, I will be sending out all these notes to you, so you do not have to write this stuff down. You will have it all accessible to you in the future. So obviously you'll want to reference the research information. Where did you get this from? Aunt Bessie told me that. My mother used to. Or, you know, according to the 1920 census, they lived at whatever. So make sure that you reference the information so that, and then if it is family lore, if it is just a story, that you say, I have always heard that my great-grandfather, Lauren Coyle, said, I eat my beans with honey. I've done it all my life. It do taste kind of funny, but it keeps them on the knife. So it's funny, but it's not, it's just a story. It's not something that's been researched. So make sure you clarify that so that the recipient knows where this story came from. So obviously then you would transform that book into the contents based on the age of the descendant that you're sharing this with. The younger kids usually are more interested in fascinating stories. You know, he was this person was a helicopter pilot, or they were an engineer on a train, or, you know, some story that really is fascinating. Where the older kids tend to be more interested in things like, you know, where did they come from and where did they live? And, you know, we've traveled there before, or I had to do a report on that in school, or, you know, they find it more interesting to get the bigger story. So again, your style of writing is going to vary based on the age of the person, or if you're doing it for a couple, or you're doing it for just one person. You're going to have to, in stage 2, you're going to have to really work hard at collecting facts, as I said before. So any documentation that you can get is really helpful. All those family stories, and of course, photographs. That's the best part. The kids really enjoy having a photo to look at, as well as us adults, of course. So you can bring these vital statistics to life. So as I said before, it's not just dates and places and names, but it's stories. So whether you find the pictures in your own collection or in a family member's collection, or you go online and you find something from a historical society that this is the way that town was in the era that my family member lived there. So getting pictures is really important, you know, where they were born, where they lived. There's so much facts out there that you can get online, whether you're on Family Search or Ancestry or any place else, to find census records, information about the dates they were in school. Sometimes you'll find resumes from people that individuals have kept. There's church records. There's lots of different information that you can find online about an individual, their military record, etc. So obviously you're going to want to have not just the person. I mean, who would want to write a biography on me unless they also include my parents and my siblings? So you want to make sure you have the whole story, or as much of the story as that person is able to absorb. If you're looking with someone who's immigrated, it's great if you can search online and find ship photos or the documentation regarding their immigration, so you know when they left Hamburg and what ship they were on and how long it took them to come across the water and where they landed and where they went from there. You know, just having that whole story. Also having milestone photos of life events. This is what John looked like when he was 3, and here he is in school, and then here he is when he gets married, and here's what he and his wife with their first child, or whatever it is. It's really nice to have those milestone photos to share. You can also highlight the information that you're writing from your own memory with information about their homes, like where they've lived, where they've worked, what their military service was, major accomplishments. And sometimes major accomplishments are things like, my mother had 11 children and she made 11 loaves of bread twice a week to feed all of us. It doesn't have to be that they got an award or whatever. It's just, what did they accomplish? What did they see as their major accomplishments in life? You can describe their personality or their character, their words of wisdom or their faith, anything they've shared with you or anything you know about them. It personalizes the story and helps the reader get a better sense of who that individual is. So you can always pass on funny stories. And again, make sure it's clear what's just been passed down through the generations. And some of them can be very interesting, and some of them you have to be very cautious and careful when you talk about families, because oftentimes there's skeletons in different people's closets. And so you have to be very tactful in the way you introduce the information. Sometimes there are murders, sometimes there's illegitimate children, sometimes there's bankruptcies, there's all different things that families don't always want to talk about, but it's part of their story and it makes them who they are. So find a very tactful way of addressing some of those things. One of the things that I suggest too is that you find a way to categorize or put the information into chapters or into sections of their life, so that you're not meandering all over the story of the person's life, but that you're keeping it in some sense of a chronological order. That helps the reader know where you're going with this. The next phase, revising the text based on the age of the descendant. So for the younger descendants, it would be easy if you added a lot more photos. You could use clip art, keep it as short and engaging as you possibly can, and also consider their age as to how you are going to have this book constructed. If they're 3, maybe you should just handwrite it and illustrate it, or type it and put it in a 3-ring binder, because they're going to rip it up at some point, rather than spending $20 or $30 and having it professionally printed. You just got to kind of make that decision of what quality of paper are you going to put in there. Maybe goes in plastic slip pages, just what's the appropriate thing. If they're 3 years old, maybe you laminate every page. You just got to decide what you got to do based on the age of the person. For the older descendants, you might want to look at things that are not just narrative about that individual, but actually that include a historical perspective, like different traditional information about your family, social issues, maybe any spiritual issues, or emotional stuff about that ancestor, especially if it's you that you're writing about. How do you feel about things? What are your beliefs? What are your morals, your values, your ethics? Another thing you can do is consider researching or writing a book with your descendants' participation, depending on their age. And I have some examples later on to show you things that children, even young grade school children, can draw or write. If you sit with them and work on this together, they can participate in creating this book for themselves and will have more potential engagement in the actual process. You can also have engaging conversations with this descendant about the ancestor, so that you know what really intrigues that person. What are they excited about? A lot of young kids are excited about things like trains and trucks and things like that. So they might be more interested in the kind of vehicles they had, or the type of job they worked, things like that. It's also suggested that you, when you're working on writing a book, that you consider having a dedication page. So besides your title page, have a dedication page where you have a personal message that you share with a specific descendant, that you talk about who helped you write this, or I got pictures from Aunt Susan, or anything that acknowledging any assistance that you got from other people in creating this. Certainly, depending on the age of the descendant that you're writing this for, you might have to be real creative in coming up with the book title. If I were to write something about my father for a great niece or nephew, I would probably, especially for the younger ones, I would probably say something about the fact that my great-grandfather was a farmer. He fed his family and the world, something like that. Where if it's more for a teenager, I would put something along the line of, the history of my great-grandfather, Dwayne. Something a little bit more boring, but not as cutesy. So you have to pay attention to the age of the person. At the end of this slide, next slide, I have the source site for this information. But I found this online, and it was a really good summary, I thought, of the things that you should think about before writing a book for children, whether it's on another topic or on your family history. So don't worry about moral lessons. Some books can be entertaining as their goal, and I think that's an important one for this topic. You're not necessarily teaching them about let's say the religious background of that person, but you're trying to help them to know who that person is, and so find stories that you can share with them that will help them to be entertained or involved in what you've written. The second point is along that same line where it says, make it interesting for them so that they get their face out of their iPad or their computer, especially now after all of this time studying school from home, but help them to feel involved in it. You can tune into your target audience by helping them to look at whatever reading level they're at and try to write to that level or just above that so that they're learning and growing into it. I thought the next point was very good, that along that same line that the kids like to read about kids that are just a little bit older than they are. So it might even be helpful to write about when your ancestor was the age of the child you're writing this book for. So also pay attention to what you're doing, how you're writing this, so that the information is of interest to the kids and is not boring to them, so to speak, that it reaches out to them and gets them involved. The next topic is, again, make it as captivating as you can, so that I want to read the next chapter, I want to read the next section, so that each section that you write leads them into the next section. So there's a little teaser at the end of every line. I wonder what happened next, that kind of a thing, so that they're wondering and wanting to read the next section. The last point that this author made was to keep the stories very short and descriptive. I'm sorry, not the story, but the actual sentences, so that they're not long and drawn out. Keep out the ands and the ors and the ums, and just get down to the brass tacks and write it so that it's readable for the level that they read at. Another site I found also had this information about different types of books. So for the younger children, number one, they like the picture books. So a lot of pictures with a few words. And I thought this was really interesting to show the numbers of words, or the level of writing for the picture books. The early readers, again, it talks about what age level they're at in the grade school level, so that might help you to think about how much am I going to write and how detailed does it need to be. Then the chapter books, I know a lot of the grade schoolers and middle schoolers, mostly grade schoolers really like those chapter books where everything literally is subdivided into chapters so that they can finish one section at a time and then move from there. Both for the middle grade school books and the adult books, the younger adults, it also indicates things that you can look at when you're creating books for them. And again, the site that I've sourced this from is listed below. I know you can't read this, but there's a lot of generic questions that you can find online, or I've got some examples later on of other places you can find them. Questions that you can look at to help you to think about what to write about this person. So this was just one example that I found. The next section is how to keep everything in context. So I really like to do this. I'm not as good at it as I could be, but using a timeline. Sometimes it's confusing when you're going back and forth with all these different documents and memories. It's like, well, when did that happen? Was that before they were married? Was that after high school? Was that before their children were born? Trying to put things in a timeline so that it chronologically comes out is also helpful when you're writing for children as well as for adults. I like to suggest that people start out with what they actually know. I remember that Grandma always told me. That type of a story where you're saying what you know, then you can add the historical facts according to the 1930 census, blah, blah, blah. Or you can actually show information that is more historical, like as it indicated earlier, information about their own community or the nation or the world. How did that impact their life? They grew up or they were a teenager in the time of World War II. How did that impact them? What was the different strikes, if there was a strike going on or if there was civil unrest or whatever at the time that they were alive, how did that impact their life? So if it's things that you don't necessarily know, ooh, I forgot, when did that happen? Go online. There are multiple resources that you can Google to find information about what happened during that span of years. And if you can't find it online or in books that you have or in the library, you can always check with the Historical Society in the area that they lived. There's usually a nice summary of what's going on in that had gone on in that community. There's oftentimes books available that you can buy for that community that tell you what the history of that community was like. In my case, my family on my paternal side lived in Iowa, northern Iowa for decades, and then some of them moved up to northern Minnesota. So I could just buy a Historical Society information buy a book about that area in 2 different areas, and I'd have most of the information that I need. So it's really kind of fun to do that. Also look at adding maps. So you can go on Google and get a Google map and copy it and stick that in the story so that they can see, oh, where did they live? Where is that town? Or if you're talking about an older ancestor, you can show the migration of first they moved to Pennsylvania, then they moved to Iowa, then they moved to Minnesota, or whatever the story might be. This is just an example of what a timeline can look like. You can do it however you want, but sometimes it's good for you when you're researching someone to put it in a timeline, and then also for a child to be able to see, oh, this happened in this order, so that the story is there, but just this timeline helps them to have a snippet of they were born, they graduated high school, they got married, they had Susie, then they had Tom, then they had Mary. Those types of stories. Then they move to another area. It helps them to keep it in perspective. If you don't have pictures of your ancestor, let's say you're writing this about your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather, you may not have pictures of that ancestor, but you can also scan documents that are online, like their draft registration form, which is one of the forms I love because it shows what's their height, their weight, their eye color, their complexion. It helps describe what that person looks like. And so if you don't have a picture, that's another way you can do it. You can also go into, and I may have this later on, but you can also go into online and find pictures like what happened in New York in 1912. Well, you can get pictures of what New York looked like in 1912. So sometimes, even though you don't have a personal picture of it, you can still show them what that community looked like at that time. One of the other things I enjoy doing is when I find a document that has the person's signature, not only do I copy the whole document, but then I scan it just to save their handwriting, their signature. And I like to put that in the story. It's fun to see how they wrote their name. It's a little bit, it's a personal touch of that individual. So as I said before, you can scan, you can add photos, or you can even draw something if you can illustrate. I can't, so I have to do cut and paste of photos, but if you can illustrate, sometimes you can illustrate the text, even if it's a stick man. If you're writing it for a 3-4-year-old, that may be fine for them. So as I said earlier, look at all the photos you have in your own collection. Contact your family or your cousins and see if there's other pictures you have of the individual you're writing the story on. Or as I said earlier, get generic photos online or from historical societies to try to describe that time frame that the person lived in. When I went to northern Iowa to visit a cousin, I went to the Historical Society, and they had this huge collection of postcards that my grandfather's sister had saved, her grandmother had saved and had donated them to the Historical Society. So I was able to just copy them onto my thumb drive, and now I have all these great pictures of these postcards that help me to see what did the stores look like when they lived there. What did the town streets look like? It was just fun. What kind of clothes were they wearing? So sometimes you can get information like that if you don't have personal photos. As far as photos are concerned, you can decide if you want them sprinkled throughout the text or if you only want them on specific pages. If you're going to print the whole thing in color, then it's going to cost you a little bit more money per page if the color pictures are on every page. Or like you've seen in some biographies, they'll have a whole book on a person, and then there'll be a section in the middle that's just the photographs. So that would be another way of doing it if you're, depending on how long the book is going to be and how expensive that might be for you. So the next section that I want to talk about is using forms like the pedigree chart or the ancestral chart. So one of the things, and I'll show you examples of it, but one of the things you can look at is using a very simplified pedigree chart based on the age of the individual so that they get a better sense of, oh, here's me, there's mom, there's daddy, that's my dad's parents, that's my mom's parents. So you might want to use, for a younger child, terms like dad's father, mom's mother, versus, you know, grandparent, great-grandparent, great-great-grandparent. That's too much for them. So you might want to look at the terminology that you use. You can also, if you have enough photos, add a photo of each person next to their name and dates in the pedigree chart so that the individual receiving this book will really get a sense of who that person is. They're learning about them, but they're also seeing them. And then they might be able to recognize them as well in other photos. So here's an example of a family tree for a very young child. You know, make it fun, make it silly. You could just, you know, find a way to take a drawing out of a coloring book or something and put the circles in for the different people of the family, whatever you want to do. Another idea is something a little bit more sophisticated, where they can see, aha, this is my family tree and here are the basic people in it. Obviously, this would be better for an older person, an older child, but to help them to see the lines that connect. This is me at the bottom, then I'm connected with my two parents, and again, here's my father's line, here's my mother's line. As I said earlier, using photos can be really helpful so that they connect the name and the face of all the people that you know. Obviously, in this example, there wasn't a photo of someone, so they put in a photo of a gravesite. They put in a document because they had no photo of that individual. Anything's better than nothing. That's my motto. When I said earlier that you could work with a descendant, you could work with a grandchild to write a story, this would be an example of a form that could be available to where they actually help you put it together. So they pick a picture out to put in. They write in the blanks, the information. So you could create something like this on your own, or you could find something that you could purchase like this or get it online. Another example, again, of how a child could help work on this story together. So you could talk about it and then they could write information down. What did they like, or what do they want to remember of the stories you just shared with them? For an older grandchild, this might be the best way to go to make it very clear. They're going to be able to understand this type of a family tree better. And you might even want to make it clear that this is your maternal side and your paternal side. There's another form which is very detailed that genealogists use. It's called a family group record. And so I know it's too small for you to read, but basically the top section is all the data about the male. The second section is all the data about the female or the second spouse. Then information about each child in the family. So you would actually have one of these forms for each family group, which is why they call it a family group record. Options for the final product. So you can do this in so many ways. You can hand print it and put in illustrations. As one of the examples was earlier, you could have the child print up the things that you discussed and they can draw, or you can paste in pictures, however you would like to do that. You can do scrapbooking, so you can use old photos and add narratives so that it's more done in a scrapbook format. You can buy books, and I'll show you examples of them when we're done. You can buy pre-printed books where they start out the sentence or they give you the topic and you hand write in your memories or any of the facts. You can get those books online. You can get them at Hallmark. They're all over the place. Another option you can do would be to actually type everything that you want to share and just print it and put it in a 3-ring binder. Find something that is just a fast and inexpensive way of putting it together. You can also have it more professionally printed and spiral bound. You can go to Kinko's, you can go to Office Depot, and it's not expensive at all to have them print it and then put it in a spiral binding. I always recommend putting the clear vinyl on top and a colored vinyl on the bottom so that things don't get spilled on it as easily, and it'll last a little bit longer and it stands up a little bit better on the bookshelf. You can also use resources like lulu.com to print a hardback book. There are lots of companies that do this. The only one that I've actually seen, I've never printed one this way, is one from Lulu. The quality of the paper was fabulous. The color of the print was wonderful. It was just amazing. So I have a quick story about that. I made a book. Actually, I did a Costco book, the next one. I did a photo book and gave it to my father at Costco, from Costco. And he was so excited to get it that he got it right before Christmas. And when the church Christmas carolers came by, he made them come in the house. Look, this is my book. It's got my name on it. It's about me. I mean, he was so proud. And I'm so thankful that I got it done because 2 months later, he passed away. So I'm very glad that I had gotten that accomplished in time for him to be able to have that all together. But you can use lots of different sources for that type of a photo book, like Costco, Walmart, Shutterfly, lots of them are out there. So you want to decide what size, how big do you want it to be? How heavy do you want it to be? When I was making a book for my mother-in-law, I decided that I had to split the book so that there was one book for about life she shared with her husband, but then there was another book about her parents and her grandparents because she's 92 and a half. And I didn't want to have a heavy book that she wouldn't be able to pick up and hold and turn the pages. So I made it into 2 small books instead of 1 big book. So you want to look at what size of book you want. What's the weight of paper? How thick is the paper? If it's a younger child, you might want it to be cardstock. If it's an older, more responsible child, you might want to just use plain paper that we would use on our printer. Think about how you want it to be bound. Do you want it to be a hardback book that's going to last for decades? Or is this something that, based on the interest level or your finances or the age of the person, that maybe just a handwritten one spiral bound is fine? Do you want to make it in color? Do you want it to be black and white? So think about these things in advance. One of the reasons I'm saying that is I did help a 90-year-old cousin who is blind write his story. He dictated it on Dragon Dictate and then emailed it to me. And then I had to do all of the paging, paragraphing, spell checking, read everything. I don't know how many times to make sure it was done. I got it finished, got it back to him. Oh, that's longer than I thought it was going to be. I can't afford to make 34 copies of that book. So then he went back and he changed it all and made it shorter. And guess what? I had to do all that work all over again. So my suggestion is figure out up front what you want the end product to be so that you know what you're going to be doing and what it might cost. Again, think about if you want your pictures in with the text or if you want them in one section of the book. Think about what font you want to use, what's readable for the age that of the recipient, what size of the typeface do you want to use. You might even want to consider leaving some pages that are blank at the end so that they can they can handwrite stories in there, or you can handwrite them later on if you've thought of something at a later point, or maybe one of your siblings or their parents want to write a story about that person as well. Also, you might want to consider, do you want a copy of that book as well, or do you just want to keep it digitally? When I did the books for my mother-in-law, both of them, my husband and I made 2 copies so that we had a copy and she has a copy and out of state. And then the other siblings of my husband, they got it digitally. If they want to print those, 300-400 pages of information, they can do it themselves. I wasn't going to print it and then ship it to them. Consider signing the book with a personal note to the descendant. The cousin that I helped write his book, he did that for me, and that was so sweet. So it is something that he's giving back to me, was his personal note of a story, thanking me basically for helping him to get his book done before he passed. So you might want to do something like that. Also, if you're gifting this to a descendant, you might want to make the presentation very special. So whether you're sitting down in some quiet time with them alone, you take them out to lunch, you go through all the photos first and then give them a book, or like I said, you work on it together, or you maybe make a special date. We're going to do this by the anniversary of that person's birthday or something like that. So make it intriguing, the reason for the timing of presenting this to the individual. So here's some examples. So this is an example of the books that you can buy where they start you out with a topic and then you just handwrite in your story. This is nice and easy because you can do a few of them while you're waiting for your favorite TV show to come on, or every morning you can write a page, or every night before you go to bed you can write a page. My father-in-law had Alzheimer's, and I was able to get him to focus on just one topic at a time. So he would actually just write about one little story at a time, and that wasn't so overwhelming for him, and he was able to do that with coaching. So that way we have his handwriting to these answers, not just me interviewing him, but his writing of these answers. So then we scanned the book and gave that scanned copy to all of his children so that they all had a copy of his handwriting. This would be an example of using Costco or Shutterfly or Walmart, the books that they have, where you can put stories as well as pictures into it. So it looks very professional. They're either bound usually in a leatherette, or sometimes they're bound like a regular book with a picture on the outside of the individual. So they can be very nice to have that type of a book. They're usually not that expensive. The ones I've done are about $20, $25, and they've turned out so nice. They're very well worth it, depending on how many grandchildren you're going to write this for. Another option, like we talked about earlier, was using the scrapbook style. So this would be an example of whether you're doing it with a person, with a descendant, or if you're doing it to give to them, you can just put it together yourself by buying the album and creating a scrapbook with all your stories in it. If you're going to go through a professional publisher like Lulu as an example, there are lots of examples of ways that you can create the book for a child, a younger child in this case, or an older child. Stories that can be shared with the next generations, and they can be very detailed, but they look very professional, and obviously, hopefully then will be cherished by that individual. So, summarizing what we've talked about, as I said at the start, it's really important to figure out who you want to gift this to, but who this is going to be about. Is it about you, about your parents, about their parent? Who is it going to be about, so that you know where you need to start collecting information? Getting the information together. Where are all your photos? What are the stories that you can share? What are the facts that you can gather online or from different individuals, or from the courthouse as an example? Marriage certificates, lots of different documents that you can use to help share information about that individual. How do you write this? You write it based on the age of the descendant. So you can collect all this information and write it for a teenager, but then you can also young it down for a younger person, so that you're still only collecting one batch of information, but you're using it for the different age levels of the children you're sharing it with. As we talked about before, going through and collecting all the local history, the person's significant history, and anything that's international that would have impacted them as well. Getting documents like creating a pedigree chart, looking at the family group record, creating those documents or obtaining those documents to help show that connection between the person who's going to receive the book and the person who the book is about. And then obviously looking at what does your final product look like? So here's some of the sources that you can utilize. Family Search is free, and they actually have, on this website, they actually have a section called Activities. And in that section, you can walk through ideas that they have on how to work with children to research and write stories about their family. The second link down is their wiki. They have their own Wikipedia on Family Search, where you can go and get more information about communities or information for free. Then there is the real big Wikipedia, where you can, again, get maps of the communities. You can get information about, oh, our family moved there in 1904 and the town was started in 1901. They were one of the founding, not necessarily the founding fathers, but they were there at the beginning of the community. So those kinds of things can be really helpful. Ancestry.com has tons of information available, but that's a paid source. So if you don't already have an account with Ancestry, you might want to consider it, but it's always best to collect the information that you have first, and everything you can access through your family, and then spend the money to go on Ancestry to get more, because you're paying by the month or by the year, and so you want to get as much together before you go on Ancestry as you can. And then there's suckers like me that have had an account on Ancestry for decades because I've been doing this for a long time. You can also look at going through your local historical society, or I should say local to where the person lived, the library, the public library, going to the courthouse, checking for military records, church records, if they have a resume from jobs they've had, obituaries, even if it's the obituary of their parents. Sometimes it's important. You can get so much information out of that. Obviously photos, and especially if someone's written on the back of the photos, it's a lot easier. Then you have this wonderful photo, you know when it was taken or what the event was or who all the people are. Sometimes letters can be absolutely fabulous. I got my hands on letters from my grandmother and my grandfather when she lived in Minnesota with the children, and he had to leave Minnesota and go to Cody, Wyoming to get employment in the 40s. So they were writing letters back and forth every week, because every week on Wednesday he would get paid, and the mailman would come to the camp, and they would have some time off to be able to, probably their lunchtime, to sign their checks and mail it to their family so they could pay the bills. So one of the cute stories that I remember reading in there was my grandfather and his brother were there together working, and he said at the end of his letter, "Gotta go now, Lloyd needs the pencil." The two of them were sharing the pencils together, the one pencil, to be able to write home to their families. So sometimes you can find wonderful information in letters. You can also interview other relatives and get information from them. Do make sure that you're sourcing that information and document who told you that story, who gave you that information. So the sources that I used, I found this great article, even though it was dated, on how to create an heirloom children's book. I have done a lot of biographies for my family, so I used a lot of the information that I use for adults and the experiences that I've gained from that, and handouts from prior presentations that I've given. And also, as you could see earlier, I went to multiple web pages to find photos and forms for you to look at. So that's the presentation for this morning. And I hope that when we are chatting at the end of this presentation, that we can share some stories about what you've already done, what you're planning to do, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to stop sharing at this time. Thank you.
Very nice.
Presentation, Paul. Really interesting.
So my goal is to, yet tonight or tomorrow, to put all of this into one Word document and send the Word document to all of you by email. So there's a few people that I don't have your email addresses, so maybe you could either send them to me or you could give them to Paula Rowe, and then I can send this out. Or maybe I can just give it to her and she can put it on the site. I'm not sure what she wants to do with that. but I'm going to try to do a little newsletter every month or so that gives you information about updated seminars that are available online and anything new that I find out, because I belong to several genealogical societies, so I can share information with you that way.